The first shovelful of earth made the sound that would haunt Kane Fletcher for the rest of his days. It was a hollow thud against the simple pine coffin that held his wife, Margaret. The drought-hardened soil of Texas in 1876 didn't give easily, not even for the dead. Kane paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn morning. His hands were blistered raw from digging since dawn. The small plot behind their modest farmhouse had never been intended as a family cemetery, but here he was, making it one. You shouldn't be doing that alone. The voice startled him. Kane turned to find Willow Davis standing at the edge of the shallow grave, her silhouette outlined against the rising sun. Her black mourning dress caught the breeze, and for a moment she looked like a shadow come to life. Mrs. Davis, Kane acknowledged with a nod, straightening his back. I didn't hear you approach. Willow had lost her own husband, Samuel, to a cattle rustling incident just 6 months prior. Her homestead bordered Kane's to the east, separated by a creek that ran dry more often than not these days. I brought food, she said, gesturing to a covered basket she'd set on the ground, and myself. Without waiting for permission, she stepped forward, reaching for the shovel in his hands. I'll help you, Kane hesitated. That's not necessary, Mrs. Davis. Willow, she corrected, her eyes meeting his. And yes, it is. I know what this day is like. Her fingers wrapped around the shovel handle, not pulling it away but holding it alongside his own grip. No one should dig a grave alone, Mr. Fletcher, Kane, he replied automatically. The dawn light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, escaped from her simple bun. There was strength in her stance that belied her slender frame. Kane, she repeated softly. Let me help. He released the shovel to her, surprised at how easily his hands surrendered the task. Willow took position at the opposite end of the grave and began to dig with practiced efficiency. The fact that she knew how to dig a grave properly was its own kind of heartbreak. How long were you married? Willow asked after several minutes of silent work. 8 years, Kane answered, finding his voice rougher than expected. Margaret was 28, Willow nodded, continuing to work. The fever takes the strongest sometimes. Samuel was 34, strong as an ox until the day 3 bullets stopped him. Kane picked up a second shovel he'd brought from the barn. They worked in tandem, neither speaking for a long while. The rhythmic sound of metal cutting earth became a strange comfort. She talked about you sometimes, Kane said eventually. Margaret, she admired your garden. A small, sad smile touched Willow's lips. And she made the finest pies in the county. I still have one of her recipe cards she shared with me last harvest. The sun climbed higher as they dug deeper. What would have taken Kane until midday was completed in a couple of hours with Willow's help. When they finished, the grave was neat and proper, deep enough to keep predators away and straight-sided as a mark of respect. They stood at the edge, both breathing heavily from the exertion. Thank you, Kane said simply. Willow nodded. When do the others arrive? They won't, he replied. Margaret's family is back east. Mine's all gone. The preacher will come by sundown. Willow studied him for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting a pain that mirrored his own. Then I'll stay. No one should bury their spouse without someone standing witness. Kane felt something shift inside him, not healing, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that perhaps the crushing weight of grief might someday be bearable. I'd be grateful for that, Willow. They walked to the house together, each step measured and heavy with the knowledge of what the day would bring. The simple farmhouse looked different, somehow emptier, as if Margaret's absence had physical weight. Inside, Willow moved with quiet efficiency, lighting the stove and setting water to boil. Kane sat at the kitchen table, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands now that they weren't holding a shovel. When was the last time you ate? Willow asked, unpacking her basket. Kane thought about it. Yesterday, maybe. The days since Margaret had taken her last breath had blurred together. Then you'll eat now, she said, placing bread, cheese, and some dried beef before him. The living must continue living, Kane. That's the hardest lesson of grief. He ate mechanically at first, then with growing appetite as his body reminded him of its needs. Willow sat across from him, drinking tea and occasionally meeting his gaze with understanding rather than pity. How do you do it? He asked finally. Get up each day. Willow considered the question seriously. At first it was spite, she admitted. I refused to let Samuel's killers take everything from me, then it became habit. Now. She looked out the window toward her own property in the distance. Now it's because I've discovered I'm stronger than I ever knew, and because Samuel would have wanted me to live, not just survive. The simplicity of her answer struck Kane deeply. He thought about Margaret, about her laughter, and how she'd always insisted on planting flowers even when crops made more sense. She would have hated to see him hollow-eyed and empty. I don't know if I'm as strong as you, he confessed. You are, Willow said with certainty. You just don't know it yet. When the preacher arrived that evening, Kane was washed and dressed in his best shirt. The grave had been lined with wildflowers Willow had gathered. 4 lanterns lit the small ceremony as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The preacher's words were standard promises of heaven and resurrection that Kane had heard before but now desperately wanted to believe. Throughout it all, Willow stood beside him, a silent pillar of strength. When his voice faltered during his final goodbye, her hand found his, squeezing gently. After the preacher left, they stood together in the growing darkness. What will you do now? Willow asked. Kane looked at the fresh mound of earth. Keep going, I suppose. The farm won't tend itself. No, she agreed. It won't, she hesitated. If you need help, I couldn't ask that of you. You have your own place to manage. Willow's expression was determined. We're neighbors, Kane. Out here, that means something. Samuel always said so. Kane nodded slowly. Margaret believed the same. As Willow gathered her things to leave, Kane walked her to the edge of his property. The night was clear, stars emerging one by one in the vast Texas sky. Thank you, he said again, for everything today. You'd have done the same, she replied with certainty. As he watched her walk away, Kane felt something unexpected, a tiny spark of hope that someday, somehow, the weight on his chest might ease enough to let him breathe freely again. What neither of them could have known then was how their shared grief would forge a bond stronger than either could imagine, or how the coming seasons would test them both in ways that would reveal not just their strength, but their capacity for a new kind of love. The weeks following Margaret's burial passed in a blur of routine for Kane. Each morning, he would wake before sunrise, half reaching across the empty space in bed before remembering. Each night, he would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, thinking of all the things he should have said while there was still time to say them. The farm demanded attention regardless of his grief. Fields needed tending, livestock required care. Kane threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on self-punishment, working from first light until his body gave out each evening. It was on one such evening, nearly a month after the funeral, that he spotted Willow riding toward his property on her chestnut mare. She carried a rifle across her saddle, a necessary precaution for a woman traveling alone, even in daylight. Kane set down the fence post he'd been repairing and waited for her approach. "Afternoon, Kane," she called as she drew closer. There was something different about her today. Her hair was braided rather than in its usual severe bun, and there was color in her cheeks from the ride. "Mrs. Davis," he responded, then corrected himself. "Willow," she dismounted with practiced ease. "I brought you some preserves," she said, removing a jar from her saddlebag, "and some news from town." Kane accepted the jar of raspberry preserves, Margaret's favorite. The gesture wasn't lost on him. "What news?" Willow tied her horse to the fence post. The Carson gang was spotted near Redemption, the marshals forming a posse. Kane's attention sharpened. The Carson gang was notorious throughout the region, cattle rustlers who'd graduated to armed robbery and worse. They were the same men who'd killed Samuel Davis. "Are you thinking of joining?" Willow asked, studying his reaction. Kane considered it. There had been a time when he would have been first to volunteer, but now, "No," he said finally. "I've got too much to do here." Something like approval flickered across Willow's face. "Good. Revenge is a poison that kills the one who carries it." "Is that why you haven't gone after them yourself?" Kane asked. The question was bold, perhaps too personal, but something about Willow invited honesty. "Who says I haven't?" she smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "I tracked them for 2 weeks after Samuel died, had one in my sights." Kane waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I couldn't pull the trigger," Willow admitted. Not because I'm weak, but because I realized Samuel wouldn't have wanted his memory stained with blood, even theirs. They stood in silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the farmyard. "Would you like to stay for supper?" Kane asked, surprising himself with the invitation. "It's nothing fancy, just stew, but there's plenty." Willow hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." "Thank you." Inside the house, Kane became acutely aware of how neglected the place had become. He'd been sleeping in the main room, unable to face the bedroom he'd shared with Margaret. Dishes were piled in the sink, and dust had gathered on the shelves. "I haven't had much time for housekeeping," he said, embarrassed. Willow glanced around but made no judgment. "Grief doesn't leave much room for sweeping," she said simply. While Kane stoked the fire and set the stew to heating, Willow moved quietly around the kitchen, washing dishes and setting the table as if she'd done it 100 times before. "You don't have to do that," Kane protested. "I know," she replied, "but it helps to keep busy in someone else's house. In my own, the silence is too loud sometimes." Kane understood that all too well. They ate together at the small kitchen table, the conversation surprisingly easy. Willow told him about her plans to expand her vegetable garden, while Kane spoke of the new calves expected in the spring. Neither mentioned their departed spouses directly, but their presence hovered in the spaces between words. As dusk fell, Kane lit a lamp. The warm glow softened the kitchen, making it feel lived in again for the first time in weeks. "I should head back before full dark," Willow said eventually, rising from the table. Kane nodded, though part of him wished she would stay longer, if only to keep the emptiness at bay for a few more hours. "I'll saddle your horse." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. "There's a storm coming," Willow observed, looking at the horizon. Kane followed her gaze to see dark clouds gathering in the distance. "It looks a ways off yet." "Still," she said, "I'd better hurry." She mounted her horse with ease, settling into the saddle. "Thank you for supper, Kane." "Thank you for the company," he replied honestly. Willow studied him for a moment. "You know, your fence line near the creek could use some work. I noticed it riding in." "I've been meaning to get to it," Kane admitted. "I could help," she offered. "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I've got nothing pressing at my place." Kane wanted to refuse, to insist he could manage on his own, but the truth was he couldn't. Not everything, not yet. "I'd appreciate that," he said finally. Willow nodded, satisfied. "I'll be by after sunrise." She turned her horse toward home, then paused to look back at him. "And Kane, try to get some rest. The dead won't fault us for sleeping." With that, she rode off, her silhouette gradually fading into the gathering darkness. That night, for the first time since Margaret's death, Kane slept in their bed. The pain was still there, sharp and real, but somehow bearable enough to face. When he dreamed, it was not of graves but of fence posts and raspberry preserves, and a woman with knowing eyes who understood the language of grief. True to her word, Willow arrived early the next morning. She wore men's trousers beneath her riding skirt, practical for the work ahead. Kane pretended not to notice the raised eyebrows of his farmhand, Miguel, when Willow dismounted and immediately asked where they should begin. "The creek section," Kane decided. "Like you said, it needs the most work." They spent the morning replacing rotted posts and mending wire, working in companionable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. Willow was stronger than she looked, handling the heavy posts with determined efficiency. "How did you learn to do this?" Kane asked as they paused to drink from a water jug. Willow wiped her brow with her sleeve. "Samuel was often away driving cattle. I had to learn to do everything." "Margaret was the same when I went on cattle drives," Kane said, the memory bittersweet. "Came back once to find she'd rebuilt half the chicken coop herself." Willow smiled. "Samuel returned from a 3-week drive to discover I'd dug a new well. He was so proud and so bothered all at once." "Men like to think we're needed," Kane admitted. "You are," Willow said seriously. "Just not always for the reasons you think." By midday, they'd made good progress. The storm that had threatened the previous evening had bypassed them, leaving the sky clear and bright. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood to eat the lunch. Willow had brought cold chicken, cornbread, and more of her preserves. "I've been thinking," Kane said, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. I've got more land than I can manage alone, especially with Miguel leaving for California next month. Willow looked at him, waiting for him to continue. Your place is smaller, but your soil is better for vegetables, Kane went on. Maybe we could help each other, share resources. Labor when needed. It was a practical suggestion, one that made sense in the harsh reality of frontier life, but both of them recognized it as something more a tentative step toward a connection that extended beyond grief. That would be sensible, Willow agreed after a moment. Samuel always said your north pasture had the best grass in the county, and Margaret envied your orchard, Kane replied. They finished their meal and returned to work, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement that they were no longer simply two people bound by a shared experience of loss, but something approaching friendship. As spring turned to summer, their arrangement evolved naturally. Twice a week, Willow would ride over to help Kane with whatever needed doing, and he would return the favor at her homestead. They mended fences, repaired roofs, and planted crops together. When Kane's cow had a difficult birth, it was Willow who stayed up all night with him to save the calf. Word spread quickly in the small community. Kane heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies, speculation about the widow and widower who spent so much time together. Some of it was kind, some was not. People are talking, he told Willow one evening as they sat on his porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. People always talk, she replied, unconcerned. They talked when I wore trousers to the general store. They talked when Samuel married me despite my father's drinking problem. Let them talk. Kane admired her resilience, her refusal to bend to others' expectations. It was something Margaret had possessed as well, that core of strength beneath a gentle exterior. Still, he said, I don't want your reputation, my reputation, Willow interrupted firmly, is my concern, not yours, unless… She looked at him directly, unless you're uncomfortable with our arrangement. Kane shook his head immediately. No, that's not it at all. The truth was, these past months with Willow had brought him back to life in ways he hadn't thought possible. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for other feelings, friendship, respect, and something else he wasn't ready to name. Good, Willow said, satisfied, because I need help with the apple harvest next week, and you're the only person tall enough to reach the highest branches without a ladder. Kane chuckled, grateful for her practicality. I'm at your service, madam. The apple harvest became another milestone in their evolving relationship. Kane spent 3 days at Willow's orchard, picking fruit and helping her process it for storage and sale. They worked well together, anticipating each other's needs without having to speak. On the final evening, as they sat at her kitchen table surrounded by the sweet smell of apple butter cooking, Kane realized with sudden clarity that he was happy. The revelation was so unexpected that he set down his coffee cup too hard, spilling some onto the tablecloth. Sorry, he mumbled, reaching for a napkin. It's just a spill, Willow said, but she was watching him closely. What is it? Kane hesitated. I just realized something. And what's that? I'm happy, he said simply. Right now, in this moment, and I feel guilty about it. Willow's expression softened. Why should you feel guilty for being happy? Because Margaret's gone, Kane said. Because she'll never harvest another apple or see another sunset. And would she want you to be miserable forever? Kane considered the question seriously. No, he admitted finally. She wouldn't. Neither would Samuel, Willow said. He used to tell me that joy was meant to be shared and that if anything happened to him, he'd haunt me if I didn't find reasons to smile again. Her lips curved upward at the memory. He was very specific about it. Kane could imagine Samuel Davis saying exactly that. He'd only met the man a few times at town gatherings, but he'd had a reputation for both fairness and good humor. Margaret made me promise to plant sunflowers every year, Kane confessed. She said they'd help me find the sun on dark days. Did you plant them this year? Willow asked. Kane shook his head. I couldn't, not yet. Next year then, Willow said with certainty, we'll plant them together. The simple promise that there would be a next year, that they would face it together, filled Kane with a warmth he hadn't expected. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and earlier sunsets, Kane found himself looking forward to Willow's visits more than he cared to admit. He began making small improvements to the house, fixing the loose step on the porch, repairing the rocking chair that had been Margaret's favorite, cleaning the windows until they shone. It was during one of these cleaning sessions that he found Margaret's journal tucked behind a loose board in their bedroom closet. He'd known she kept one but had always respected her privacy. Now, with trembling hands, he opened it to the last entry, dated just days before she fell ill. "Kane worked until sunset again today," she had written in her neat, flowing script. "He worries so much about providing, about making sure we have enough. I wish he could see what I see, that we already have everything that matters. If anything should happen to me, I hope he finds someone who makes him understand that love isn't measured in acres or cattle, but in moments of quiet joy." Kane closed the journal, tears streaming unchecked down his face. It was as if Margaret had reached across the divide between life and death to give him permission to live, to find joy, perhaps even to love again. That evening, when Willow arrived with a basket of late summer vegetables from her garden, Kane met her at the gate rather than waiting on the porch as usual. "I found something today," he said without preamble. "Margaret's journal." He hesitated. "She wrote about what she wanted for me if she died." Willow set down her basket, giving him her full attention. "And what did she want?" "For me to find joy again," Kane said simply. "To understand what truly matters." Something shifted in Willow's expression, a softening, a hope. "That sounds like what a woman who loved you would want." "What about you?" Kane asked. "What do you think Samuel would want for you?" Willow looked out across the land, the setting sun painting everything in gold and amber. "He made me promise not to become bitter," she said finally. "Said that would be letting the darkness win." She met Kane's gaze directly. "I think he'd want me to be brave enough to recognize happiness when it finds me again." They stood together in the golden light, on the threshold of something new and fragile and full of possibility. "Would you like to stay for supper?" Kane asked, as he had that first time months ago. Willow nodded. "I'd like that very much." As they walked toward the house, Kane didn't take her hand, but their shoulders brushed and neither moved away from the contact. That night, they talked longer than they ever had before. Willow told Kane about growing up in St. Louis, about her father's decline into alcoholism after her mother died, about meeting Samuel when he came to buy horses from their failing farm. "He saved me," she said simply. "Not just from circumstances, but from becoming hard and closed off." In turn, Kane spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of coming west after the war with dreams of open spaces and freedom, of meeting Margaret at a town dance and knowing instantly that she was the one. "She laughed at my terrible dancing," he recalled, smiling at the memory. "But she kept dancing with me anyway." As the hour grew late, Kane walked Willow to her horse, both of them reluctant for the evening to end. "Kane," Willow said as she prepared to mount, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The Harvest Festival is next weekend in town." She looked at him directly. "Would you consider going with me?" The Harvest Festival was the biggest social event of the year in their small community. Attending together would be a clear statement to everyone that they were. "What exactly?" Kane wasn't sure he could name it yet, but he knew he wanted to find out. "I'd be honored," he said. Willow's smile lit up her face in the moonlight. "Good, it's been too long since either of us danced." As he watched her ride away, Kane felt lighter than he had in months. He looked up at the stars overhead, so clear and bright in the vast Texas sky, and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret." The week leading up to the Harvest Festival was filled with anticipation and nervous energy. Kane found himself paying unusual attention to his appearance, trimming his beard neatly and polishing his best boots until they shone. He even rode to town midweek to purchase a new shirt, ignoring the knowing looks from the shopkeeper's wife. When Saturday arrived, Kane was ready an hour early, pacing the house with growing nervousness. What if this was a mistake? What if people talked? What if a knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts? Opening it, he found Willow standing there in a dress the color of autumn leaves, her dark hair arranged in an elegant twist with a few curls framing her face. She looked beautiful in a way that caught his breath. "You're early," he managed. "So are you," she replied with a knowing smile, taking in his pressed shirt and polished boots. I thought we might walk together instead of riding. It's such a beautiful day. The walk to town was pleasant, the October air crisp and fragrant with pine and sage. They talked easily about ordinary things: the weather, the upcoming cattle auction, Willow's plans to add beehives in the spring. As they approached the town square, where colorful bunting and lanterns had transformed the usual dusty space, Kane felt a moment of hesitation. Everyone would be watching, judging. Willow seemed to sense his unease. "We can still turn back," she offered quietly. Kane looked at her, this strong, kind woman who had helped him bury his wife and then, gradually, helped him find his way back to living. "No," he said with sudden certainty. "I want to be here, with you." The festival was everything a harvest celebration should be: tables laden with food, musicians playing lively tunes, children running and laughing between the stalls of local crafts and produce. Kane and Willow's arrival together drew exactly the attention Kane had expected, but he found he minded less than anticipated. They spent the afternoon moving through the festival, stopping to speak with neighbors and sample the various foods on offer. Kane found himself actually enjoying the conversations, realizing how isolated he'd become in his grief. "Kane Fletcher?" A booming voice called out as they examined a display of handcrafted quilts. Kane turned to find Marshall Daniels approaching, hand extended. "Good to see you in town, son." "Marshall," Kane greeted him, shaking his hand. "You remember Mrs. Davis?" "Of course," the marshal said, tipping his hat to Willow. "Good to see you both out and about." There was genuine warmth in his voice, without the judgment Kane had feared. As the day progressed into evening, lanterns were lit around the square and the band struck up a waltz. Couples began to move onto the wooden dance floor that had been constructed for the occasion. Kane looked at Willow, who was watching the dancers with a wistful expression. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. Willow turned to him, hope and hesitation mingled in her expression. "Are you sure?" In answer, Kane offered his hand. Willow took it and he led her to the edge of the dance floor. "I should warn you," he said as they took position, "I'm still a terrible dancer." "That's all right," Willow replied, her eyes bright with something that might have been happiness. "I'm good enough for both of us," and she was. As they moved across the floor, Willow followed his lead effortlessly, making even his awkward steps seem intentional. The music surrounded them, and for a few precious minutes, it was as if they were alone in their own world of melody and movement. When the song ended, neither pulled away immediately. They stood close, hands still joined, something unspoken passing between them. "Kane," Willow said softly. Well, if it isn't the merry widow and the grieving husband," a slurred voice interrupted. Kane turned to find Thomas Barker, a local troublemaker known for his mean temper when drinking, standing nearby with a bottle in hand. "Ain't been 6 months, and you're already dancin' on your wife's grave, Fletcher?" Kane felt Willow tense beside him. His own anger flared hot and immediate. "You're drunk, Barker," he said evenly. "Go home before you say something you'll regret," Barker sneered. "And you're a hypocrite. Your wife barely cold in the ground, and here you are, courtin' the Davis widow like a—" He never finished the sentence. Marshall Daniels appeared as if from nowhere, gripping Barker's arm firmly. "That's enough, Tom. You're coming with me to sleep it off." As the marshal led the protesting Barker away, Kane turned to Willow, who stood rigid with anger and humiliation. "I'm sorry," he said. "We shouldn't have come." "No," Willow said firmly. "Don't let him ruin this." She looked around at the other festival goers, many of whom were pretending not to have witnessed the confrontation. "But perhaps we should go." They walked home in silence, the festive sounds fading behind them. The night had turned cooler, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. When they reached the point where the path split, one fork leading to Kane's farm, the other to Willow's homestead, they stopped. "Willow," Kane began, "what Barker said was the product of a small mind and too much whiskey," she interrupted. "I don't care what he thinks, I care what you think." Kane took a deep breath. "I think that I've been afraid of dishonoring Margaret's memory. Afraid of what people would say." He looked at Willow directly. "Afraid of how much I've come to care for you." Willow's expression softened. "And now I'm still afraid," Kane admitted. "But I'm more afraid of not telling you the truth. That being with you brings me joy." That I look forward to seeing you more than anything else. He hesitated, then pushed forward. That I'm falling in love with you, Willow Davis, and I don't know what to do about it. Willow was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable in the starlight. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hand came up to touch his face, gentle and sure. You don't have to do anything about it, she said softly. Except perhaps kiss me if you'd like to. Kane hesitated only a moment before leaning down to press his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they pulled apart, Willow's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I never expected this, she whispered. To feel this way again. Neither did I, Kane admitted. Is it wrong? Willow shook her head firmly. No. It's the most right thing in the world. Samuel would understand. I think Margaret would too. They stood together at the crossroads, neither wanting to part. Finally, Kane made a decision. I'll walk you home, he said. The path to Willow's homestead was familiar to him now, but walking it beside her with this new understanding between them made it feel different, full of possibility and promise. At her door, they kissed again, longer this time with growing certainty. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Good night, Willow, Kane said, reluctant to leave. Good night, Kane, she replied. I'll see you tomorrow. It was both a question and an invitation. Tomorrow, he confirmed, and the day after that. As he walked home beneath the star-filled sky, Kane felt a sense of rightness settle over him. He would always love Margaret, carry her in his heart. But his heart, he was discovering, had room for a new love too different, but no less true. The winter of 1876-77 proved to be unusually harsh. Snow came early and stayed, blanketing the Texas landscape in white. The creek between Kane's and Willow's properties froze solid, creating a natural bridge that they crossed often to visit each other. Their relationship deepened with the season. What had begun as friendship born of shared grief had blossomed into something neither had expected to find again: love, rich and complex, shaped by their past losses but not defined by them. They established a routine. Sundays were spent together, alternating between their homes. They would share meals, read to each other from books or newspapers, and simply enjoy each other's company. The rest of the week, they tended to their separate responsibilities, though they found more and more reasons to help each other as the winter progressed. Town gossip continued, but it had lost its power to trouble them. When Willow purchased fabric for new curtains at Kane's house, the shopkeeper's eyebrows raised, but she simply smiled and added a length of material for a shirt as well. By Christmas, they had stopped pretending they weren't building a life together. Kane spent the holiday at Willow's homestead, bringing with him a handcrafted rocking chair he'd been working on in secret. It's beautiful, Willow said, running her hands over the smooth wood. It's practical, Kane replied with a smile, for long winter evenings. Willow's gift to him was equally meaningful: a journal bound in leather with a note inside that read simply, "For new memories." That night, as they sat before the fire, Kane found himself thinking of the future in a way he hadn't allowed himself to for months. He watched Willow as she read, the firelight playing across her features, and knew with sudden clarity what he wanted. "Willow," he said, setting aside his coffee. "I've been thinking," she looked up, marking her place in the book. "About what? About us, about the future." Kane moved from his chair to kneel beside her rocker. "I know it's only been 7 months since Margaret passed. People will talk even more than they already do. But I don't want to wait any longer to ask you this." Willow set her book aside, her eyes never leaving his face. "I love you," Kane said simply. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to make it official. Marry me, Willow." For a moment, she was perfectly still. Then tears welled in her eyes, spilling over. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "It hasn't even been a year for either of us." "I'm sure," Kane said firmly. "Time doesn't matter, what we feel does." Willow reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, Kane Fletcher." Kane took her hand and kissed her palm. "When?" "Spring," Willow decided after a moment's thought. "When your sunflowers bloom." The winter months passed in a blur of preparations and growing anticipation. They decided to combine their properties, making improvements to Kane's larger house where they would live together. Willow's homestead wouldn't be sold but would serve as a rental property, providing additional income. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the community. Most reactions were supportive, though some considered it too soon after their respective losses. The pastor raised concerns about propriety, but eventually agreed to perform the ceremony when the time came. One snowy evening in February, as they sat together planning the details of their wedding, Kane broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Willow, have you ever thought about children?" he asked cautiously. Willow's hands stilled over the list she'd been making. "Yes," she said softly. "Samuel and I tried for years, but it never happened for us." She looked up at him. "Why do you ask?" "Margaret and I wanted children too," Kane said. "It just wasn't in God's plan for us, I suppose." He took her hand. "But I was wondering if you might want to try again, with me." Willow's expression softened. "I'd like that very much," she said. "A child of our own." Kane squeezed her hand. "Or maybe more than one." As March arrived, bringing the first signs of spring, Kane began preparing the ground for the sunflower seeds. He chose a spot just beyond the front porch where they would be visible from the house and catch the best of the morning sun. Willow joined him on a mild afternoon as he worked the soil. "Margaret would approve," she said, watching him create neat rows. "I think so too," Kane agreed. "She always said sunflowers have to work hard to follow the sun, but the effort makes them strong." "A bit like us," Willow observed. Kane smiled at her. "Exactly like us." They planted the seeds together, a promise for the future taking root in the warming earth. As they worked, Kane found himself thinking of the strange, winding path that had brought them here, how a shared grave had somehow led to shared joy. The weeks passed, and with them came increasing activity as they prepared for their new life together. Kane added a room to the house for the children they hoped to have. Willow expanded the garden, incorporating some of her favorite plants from her own property. By early May, the sunflowers were growing tall and strong, their faces not yet turned to the sun but promising to do so soon. The wedding was set for the first Sunday in June, when they would be in full bloom. 3 days before the wedding, Kane rode into town for final supplies. As he loaded his purchases onto his wagon, a commotion drew his attention to the jailhouse across the street. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in excitement. "What's happening?" Kane asked a bystander. "Marshall caught 2 of the Carson gang," the man replied eagerly. "Brought him in an hour ago." Kane's heart quickened. The Carson gang, the men who had killed Samuel Davis. Without conscious thought, he found himself crossing the street, pushing through the crowd until he reached the jailhouse steps. Inside, Marshall Daniels was recording information in the logbook while 2 men sat manacled in the cell. One was older, gray-haired and hard-faced. The other was younger, perhaps Kane's age, with a fresh bullet wound in his shoulder. "Fletcher," the marshal acknowledged, looking up. "Come to see justice at work." "These are from the Carson gang?" Kane asked, his voice steadier than he expected. The marshal nodded. "Got them trying to rob the mail coach. The others got away, but we'll find them." He studied Kane's face. "Thought you might want to know, given what they did to Samuel Davis." Kane looked at the prisoners. Which one of them had pulled the trigger that killed Samuel? Did it matter? "Has Willow been told?" he asked. "Not yet," the marshal replied. "Thought you might want to tell her yourself." Kane nodded his thanks and left, his mind racing. How would Willow react to the news? Would it reopen old wounds, bring back the grief they'd both worked so hard to move beyond? And what of her words months ago that she'd had one of the gang in her sights, but couldn't pull the trigger? When he arrived home, Willow was in the garden, her hands deep in the rich earth as she planted the last of the vegetables. She looked up at the sound of his wagon, her face breaking into a smile that faded as she took in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, rising to her feet and wiping her hands on her apron. "Kane, what's wrong?" "They caught 2 of them," he said simply. "The Carson gang. They're in jail in town." Willow went very still. "Which ones?" "I don't know their names, an older man and a younger one with a shoulder wound." Willow's hand went to her throat. "David Carson and his nephew, most likely." Her voice was calm, but Kane could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes. "When will the trial be?" the marshal didn't say. "Soon, I'd guess." Willow nodded slowly. "I need to see them." Kane hadn't expected that. "Why?" "Because I need to," she said simply. Will you come with me?" "Of course," Kane replied without hesitation. "Whenever you're ready." They rode to town together the next morning, the journey mostly silent. Kane watched Willow from the corner of his eye, trying to gauge her state of mind. She rode straight-backed and determined, her face set in lines he hadn't seen in months. At the jailhouse, Marshal Daniels greeted them solemnly. "Mrs. Davis," he said, tipping his hat, "I expected you might come." "I want to see them," Willow said without preamble. The marshal hesitated. "Mrs. Davis, Willow, are you sure that's wise? The trial will begin next week. You'll have to face them then." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I need to do this, today." The marshal looked to Kane, who nodded slightly. "All right," he conceded, "but only for a few minutes." He led them back to the cells where the two men were confined. They looked up as Willow approached, curiosity turning to wariness as they took in her formal black dress and steady gaze. "This is Mrs. Davis," the marshal announced. "Samuel Davis's widow." Recognition flickered across the older man's face. The younger one just looked confused. "You killed my husband," Willow said, her voice remarkably steady. "Shot him 3 times when he caught you stealing his cattle." The older man, David Carson, Kane assumed, shrugged. "Lady, we've killed a lot of men, can't remember all of them." Kane felt a surge of rage at the casual dismissal of Samuel's life, but Willow's hand on his arm kept him still. "I came here to tell you something," Willow continued, addressing Carson directly. "I tracked you for 2 weeks after you killed him, had you in my rifle sights outside of Redemption." Carson's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you take the shot then?" "Because killing you wouldn't bring Samuel back," Willow said simply. "And because I refused to let you take anything more from me, not my home, not my future, and certainly not my soul." She took a deep breath. "I didn't come for revenge or forgiveness. I came to show you that you failed. You took Samuel's life, but you didn't break mine." With that, she turned away from the cell. "I'm ready to go now," she said to Kane. Outside, in the clear May sunshine, Kane took Willow's hand. "Are you all right?" She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I needed to see them, to know they were just men, not monsters, not ghosts. Just flawed, cruel men who will face justice." She looked up at Kane. "And I needed to say goodbye to that part of my life once and for all." Kane understood. It was closure not just of Samuel's death, but of the period of grief and anger that had followed. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Willow Davis," he said softly. She smiled through her tears. "Soon to be Willow Fletcher," she reminded him. 3 days later, on a perfect June morning, the sunflowers Kane had planted turned their faces to the sun just as Willow walked toward him in a simple cream-colored dress, a crown of wildflowers in her dark hair. The ceremony was small, just a handful of friends gathered in front of the house where they would build their life together. The pastor spoke of new beginnings, of love that grows from unexpected places, of the bravery required to open one's heart after loss. Kane and Willow spoke their vows clearly and confidently, promises made not in the flush of youth, but with the wisdom that comes from having loved and lost and found the courage to love again. "With this ring, I thee wed," Kane said, sliding a simple gold band onto Willow's finger. "With this ring, I thee wed," Willow echoed, placing a matching band on Kane's hand. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the pastor proclaimed. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Kane kissed his bride as their small gathering of friends applauded. The sunflowers seemed to nod their approval in the gentle June breeze. That evening, after their guests had departed, Kane and Willow sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Are you happy, Mrs. Fletcher?" Kane asked, his arm around his new wife's shoulders. Willow leaned into him, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "Completely," she answered. "And you, Mr. Fletcher?" Kane looked out at the land that stretched before them, their land now, a testament to what they had built together and what they would continue to build in the years to come. "More than I ever thought possible again," he said truthfully. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, they sat in companionable silence, two people who had found each other in grief and built something beautiful from the ashes of their previous lives. The sunflowers would bloom all summer, following the sun's journey across the sky with steadfast devotion. And when autumn came and their heads grew heavy with seeds, Kane and Willow would harvest them together seeds for next year's flowers, and the year after that, and all the years to come. Life in the wild Texas frontier wasn't easy, but they faced it together, the droughts and the rains, the good harvests and the bad, the joys and the sorrows that came with building a life. And every spring, Kane planted sunflowers, a reminder of promises kept in love that had flourished in the most unlikely of circumstances. 2 years after their wedding, on another perfect June day, Willow gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose Fletcher. The following year, a son joined their family, Samuel Kane Fletcher. The children grew strong and healthy, surrounded by love and stories of the grandparents they would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in the values their parents instilled in them. In time, the whispers about the widower who had married the neighbor's widow faded. What remained was respect for a family that had faced adversity with grace and courage, and built something enduring from the broken pieces of their past. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Kane and Willow would sit together on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the sunflowers turn their faces toward the setting sun, steadfast, resilient, ever faithful to the light.